So my name's Keil and I want to talk to you about a simple tool that I use in my practice and has recently started being used in some workshops called the Imaginal Garden, which I run with Alona Harker and some others. I want to convince you that thinking about your personality in a fractured way rather than whole is actually very useful, and that learning to talk to the bits is the way to perhaps a healthy mind and much more. I want to start with a little exercise which will make me feel much better on stage. So could everyone please think of someone they love? It's not a competition. You don't have to think of the person you love most, just pick someone that you love. I just want you to close your eyes and really picture that person in your mind and feel the kind of love you feel for them. The type of love you feel for each person is subtly different. If you're thinking of a child, it'll be quite protective. If you're thinking of a lover, it'll obviously have sexual edges and so on. Now I want you to gather up the love, let the person go, just gather up that love that you're feeling in imaginary arms. Gather it up as a thing. Try to feel, what's its texture? Does it have a colour in your mind? Does it have a weight? Is it moving or still? And now I want you to gather up even tighter, and I'd like you to kind of, in your mind's eye, throw it up into the air and let it float over here onto my head and explode. Which is a remarkably effective exercise for anyone that's anxious on stage, but also teaches us a number of really important things about how our imagination works, apart from the fact that imagination, as we all know, is extraordinarily powerful and may be the major differentiator between us and most other creatures in the world, although there is obviously some present in all creatures. The first thing that's illustrated, which I rather like, is this idea of a felt sense. Now, the felt sense idea, as far as I know, comes from a chap called Gendlin, who is behind a lot of the work I do. He developed this thing called focusing. When you think of the person, you have a felt sense of them. You don't need to think of their history. You don't need any of that background stuff. Somehow your body and your mind carries this felt sense. You know who it is just by that sense. And when you think of the love you feel for them, it also has its own particular felt sense. And those ideas and how you can kind of get the particular qualities of that inner character and that inner feeling are critical to this kind of work. Now, so in a way what I'm doing when I do this work with people is I'm getting their imaginations to imagine themselves, which is a very, when you think about this self-realising, the self-realising is a peculiar idea and one that many of you here I'm sure have battled with and baffled with for many years. Now, the workshop itself came about because I've got this tool that I'm calling the Imaginal Garden, and I've been using it with my clients, and I've been practicing versions of it on myself for years. I suffer from depression. I remember well Harry Freeman actually giving me a lovely image for this idea, saying that the unconscious doesn't go down hierarchically forever. It's kind of a landscape with characters on it that you need to get to know. And that basic idea has been central to this work ever since. Anyway, I was doing this work with a very good friend of mine now, a client called Alona Harker, who's given my permission to tell this story. She came to me with very bad depression, and some years later she went away vastly better. And we lost touch a fair bit. And then about a year later she called me up and said, I'd like to run some workshops using that technique you taught me. And why? And the reason was that because she'd done that workshop, not only had she basically got a life together, her creative life had taken off in really dramatic ways, and she felt that it was far too much fun and too important not to try to share it with others, which has been very cool for me. We've mostly focused on creativity at this point, looking at the muse and the critic, but we've got some other ideas of where to go later. And we've had fantastic anecdotal feedback, guys that have done albums after being blocked for a couple of years and so on. Not only for differences in the artistic life, but much more. So there's some key ideas we need to get to sort of understand why this work matters. Firstly, this thing that's our consciousness, this emergent quality, only covers a tiny bit of whatever's going on at any one time. So the big thing is that we're relying all the time for our survival on a bunch of characters inside us who run our automatic and learnt systems, from your breathing rate to the driving of your car. And we all know that experience of driving home with no awareness of having done so. Fear-based responses are a very strong example of how your total being can be taken over by a character from within you that completely takes over the way you think. You don't think very well anymore, or most of us don't, some do. And your whole way of being in the world is suddenly totally different if you are in a state of fear. And the other thing that's interesting is that we think we are in control of ourselves, but recent research, including functional magnetic resonance imaging and so on, is suggesting that really we don't have much idea. Often we make decisions that we think are consciously decisions we've made, when in fact they were made long before our monkey mind jumped in to provide the reasons and the justification afterwards. And we aren't even aware of that process. So there's a lot going on inside us that we have very little control over. This technique that I'm using has become central to my work because as a naturopath and practitioner, I use an empowerment model. And that model is based on the idea of trying to cover the different areas of a person's life and make sure that everything is in place to ensure that they have as much control, as much self-autonomy as they can. And yet over and over again, instead of focusing on all sorts of other issues around perhaps medication or whatever, we kept coming back, most of my clients kept coming back to me for work at this level of trying to communicate with themselves. It would seem that we don't have successful tools for this as a general rule, and I don't know why not, but obviously my work is booming sort of because people don't have them and they come to, and the word of mouth is sending people to me to learn them. What's nice about them is that of course they're easy once learnt to take home and do yourself. So this work is based on the maxim of know thyself. To know someone, you can study them, you can observe appearance and behaviour, and you can relate to them. And in the therapeutic setting, that's what we do. We ask them, we get them to look at the depression, for example, the triggers, the various environmental factors, the perhaps contributing genetic factors. But then we bring up the character in itself in that felt sense way, and we can talk to that character. It often will present perhaps as a large, formless, dark cloud, but with conversation and relationship, it will break down and become much more manageable and slowly reveal its inner sort of mechanisms. The tools used are easy. They're techniques that most people here would know: relaxation, meditation, guided imagination, guided self-hypnosis, active imagination, and so on. My own approach owes a lot to an old friend in Tassie, Helen Rees, a local white witch, Bubula Lardi, and the focusing models that I mentioned before by Gendlin. We set rules for the landscape you're going to go into to make it safe. I will never meet anything I'm not ready for, although I often find that people are ready for far, far more than they expect. The cool thing about this process for many practitioners, and I think for many clients, is you don't need to actually analyse or relive anything. We're dealing here, I'm not saying analysis isn't useful, please. It is. It often creates insight and that's life-changing. But in this work we're interested in the kind of world of symbolic reasoning and the constructs of your mind, not whether they are the products of genetics or trauma. Whatever the issue is, let's deal with it directly as a living character and work out what's going on. The other cool thing about this process is that it's fast and very stripped down. We're flexible beings, we have plastic brains and all that sort of thing, but the old tools for psychological maturing, the initiations, the church, the tribe, the village, are melting away around us. We live in a very rapidly changing world that expects us to individuate quite radically. And I think what this process is part of a general movement towards creating individuated kind of archetypal or mythical structures for people that make their own lives make sense for them. So the painting behind me is one of mine, and it's for sale if anybody would like to buy it. And it kind of summarises this model a little for you. As you can see, you've got the face over here, which is, I think, the projected persona that most of us put out to the world. And within it is the ship of fools. At the very bottom of the ship is the stuff that you've never brought into your consciousness at all. It lives in that dark hole. They're the horrors and the frightening demons that we all carry within us that are sort of so deep and strange that we generally never come across them. On the deck, of course, are those characters that we live with in our lives all the time, and they have many, many forms and morph and flow together in different ways. There's the consciousness that you are, sitting right up at the front with the monkey covering its eyes. There's the little character trying to see through the mess of your thoughts into the world clearly. There are those parental forms and other backwards-looking characters that drag you back to the past. And of course there are the various present selves with their sexual urges and other social urges and so on. So I'm imagining the landscape within as filled with living creatures. The main characteristic, in fact, of this inner landscape is that it is alive and demands expression. So here we go back, obviously, to one of the first great shaman of this world, Jung, who very much, I think, saw the inner world as like this. And the exact emerging forms that come up for people are inclined towards classic archetypes as developed by Jung and others. But they veer off in very, very individual directions in many, many people. I try to keep these models very simple and flexible, and I don't claim them as truth. I think they are just that, models for looking at something that is truly mysterious, our inner workings. It seems to me that the characters that come up inside people have within them characters, and maybe it goes all the way down, a kind of fractal thing. But the other thing that's very cool is that mostly the characters you bring up are totally on your side, normally just immature or undeveloped in some way or unbalanced. Anger is an extraordinarily good example. The number of times that I've found with only 1 or 2 sessions, or with only 1 session and a lot of homework, people take their anger from an immature, raging creature and turn it into an ally in their world is remarkable. And why? Because the anger just didn't grow up. They got to a point in their lives, normally around adolescence or somewhere, and they locked it down because you can't afford to be too angry in the world. So, to conclude, I really just want to say that whether you come to do a workshop like this or find a practitioner like myself who works with this kind of inner stuff, I think it's bloody important. I think in a really rapidly changing world, we need technologies for our heads that allow us to run ourselves in better ways. We do it in all sorts of external ways all the time, but we do not seem to have developed these technologies for inside ourselves very well at all. This is a kind of shamanism stripped bare. It takes little bits from lots of practices, but leaves out all of the other stuff that's associated with the culture, the history and so on, and just tries to take the tools. I think there are lots of versions of it around. I'd like to encourage all of you to think about whether the children you know have any capacity at all to identify how different they are when they're in the different spaces within them, the different personas come up. How are you when you're at work or when you're at play? And how different is that? How coherent is it? So I really want you to start thinking of yourself as made of many different characters who emerge at different times. I'd like you to consider the ways in which they clash and cooperate. There is a whole universe inside us. It has its own rules and topography. Find a way to get in there and meet the characters who live there that make up the complex thing that is you. Thank you.